LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the June 3rd edition of LiberalViewer Monday Media Mixup. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the 11 best, most newsworthy clips I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be really educational, informative, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all today. Finally, the topic of the week is convicted felon Donald Trump. Donald Trump convicted of 34 felonies, falsifying business records in New York to cover up some other crime. There was sort of a take your pick of one of three other crimes he was trying to cover up, for those of you who followed this closely. But for those of you who watch my Monday Media Mix-Up the last several weeks, you know that I've been kind of frustrated that there were several other big news stories or campaign coverage, and this never seemed to be like the main topic on all the shows. But this week, there's no denying it. The former president of the United States is a convicted felon, convicted by a jury of his peers in New York, and I'm looking forward to discussing a lot of the issues with you using the news summaries and the newsmaker clips, all of which cover the main topic for once. And I'm going to show you several Republicans attacking the verdict, and then I will also show you a former Manhattan DA, Cyrus Vance, defending it, as well as one, sort of Democrat, Juan Williams, giving like the only pro-verdict commentary on all of Fox News Sunday. There'll definitely be some Fox News bias, both in the Fox News Sunday news summary and then in that panel discussion that I'll talk about when I get to those clips. But I also decided to use Fox News for my political comedy because the lengths, the weird arguments they make to try to, defend Donald Trump and how the trial's a sham and it's rigged and all these, they have all these bogus arguments, but I don't even understand the argument that Jesse Waters tried to make on The Five on Friday about the liberal media who are supposedly liberal media who are supposedly celebrating the conviction of Donald Trump. And he decided to use an analogy that maybe you can explain it to me. I'll talk about it with you a little more after we watch that brief clip from Friday together over here.
Donald Trump's the victim of this case. Permission to make an analogy.
Permission granted.
This is like it's like someone taking a huge bong hit, holding it in, because you got to hold it in, right, Harold?
I've never done that.
You blow it right into someone's face, right? Mm-hmm. And then you demand they get drug tested. What happens on the drug test? Oh, they're positive, cannabis. And then you're celebrating they're positive. You blew smoke in their face. What do you think is going to happen?
You hotboxed him.
You hotboxed Trump.
The legal system somehow hotboxed Donald Trump. I don't even get what the argument. Usually I understand the false, bogus claims they're trying to further with whatever weird arguments and analogies they make, and they make some pretty bad ones. But that one, I have no idea what he was talking about there, but you can let me know what you think in the comment section or what you think that meant. I just saw, I talked about falsifying business records in the first degree to cover up another crime. And I saw in the live comments that someone was asking, how can you turn a misdemeanor into a felony? Well, here, I put a link down in the video description to the New York Consolidated Law. This is the law in New York. They didn't make this up for Donald Trump. It says a person is guilty of falsifying business records in the first degree when he commits the crime of falsifying business records in the second degree. That's the misdemeanor. When his intent to defraud includes an intent to commit another crime or to aid or conceal the commission thereof. So you don't even have to commit the other crime. You just have the intent to commit another crime or to conceal the commission of another crime. And there were like a few different options. One was the federal campaign election crime that Michael Cohen actually pled guilty to in the Southern District of New York, which was controlled by the Trump Justice Department at the time. And in that plea that the U.S. attorney appointed by Trump accepted, and U.S. attorneys aren't supposed to accept pleas that where they don't believe the facts are true. Michael Cohen pled guilty to committing those campaign finance violations as directed by Donald Trump. That's in his plea. I think I have a link down to Michael Cohen's plea allocution. But here, this is from one of the two counts. In count number 8. On or about October 2016, in coordination with and at the direction of the same candidate, I arranged to make a payment to a second individual. This is $130,000 to Stormy Daniels. So he made this campaign contribution, or this $130,000 payment to benefit the Trump campaign, and it was never reported. It actually kind of came from the Trump organization, which is a corporation. Corporations can't donate to campaigns. There are multiple ways. And there's also even a tax fraud charge that he could have been concealing, and also a New York election law violation. So there are multiple violations, and the New York law already says if you falsify business records to cover up another crime, it is a felony. So I hope that answers that first question in the live comments. And now I'm going to get to the news summaries, and I'm going to start with the longest one, which is also the most biased one. Fox News has been incredibly biased. There's no two sides. Everyone on Fox News pretty much must say that the verdict is rigged. It's, the judge was conflicted. The law made no sense. They made, that no one understands what the charges are, even though I just explained it to you in 2 minutes. And so here you can see a news summary where it starts off with Shannon Bream emphasizing, Trump raised all this money after the verdict, and he has all these strong grounds for an appeal, and they emphasize Trump's denial. So it's all spun in the Trump direction. And then they have on two legal experts who are both on Trump's side, just like every single person on Fox News almost exclusively takes the side of Trump. I'm going to show you the brief glimmer of a more left side perspective from Juan Williams when I get over to the first Newsmaker clip after the news summaries, clip 7. But this is clip 2, the Fox News Sunday news summary, followed by Jonathan Turley and Thomas Dupree, the two hack lawyers shilling for Donald Trump, over in this clip.
Hello from Fox News in Washington. President Trump raising tens of millions of dollars in new donations and planning to appeal his criminal conviction. As his legal team juggles several other state and federal cases, none of them likely to be resolved before the November election. He's speaking out this weekend in an exclusive interview with Fox and Friends on the Fox News Channel.
I did absolutely nothing wrong. I mean, absolutely. Think of it. I hate what they say, a bookkeeping, this and that. It's not. It's called, think of it, expense. I use the word expense. Legal expense. I pay a lawyer. He wasn't a fixer. A bookkeeper, without ever speaking to me, because she did the right thing, who's been with me for years, marks it down as legal expense. In other words, I paid a legal expense. It's marked down as a legal expense. And they say that's a fraud.
In a moment, House Speaker Mike Johnson joins us with reaction to the verdict and to news that the president is expected to announce executive actions on the border by Tuesday. But first, what's next for President Trump and his legal team as Hunter Biden's federal gun trial is also set to kick off on Monday? Let's break it down with George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley, also a Fox News contributor, and former Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree. Fancy meeting you here. We are back together to talk about what's happened and what is still to come. Okay, let's start with this. Sentencing comes on July 11th. Reuters asked the question, could Trump go to prison? In deciding the sentence, Merchan, the judge, may weigh the underlying seriousness of the charges due to their ties to the 2016 election, as well as Trump's decision to go to trial rather than accept responsibility by pleading guilty. Jonathan, you and I spent a lot of time in this courthouse watching this whole thing play out. Would anything surprise you from Judge Merchan?
No, after watching him in court, quite frankly, I would have said that the very concept of jail for something like this would be otherworldly and ridiculous. After watching him in the courtroom, I must say I have some doubts in my mind, but it would go against the overwhelming weight of past cases. You've got a nonviolent offense by a first offender, elderly defendant. I would be very surprised, but there is a menu of other options, from community service to home confinement. In my view, a conditional dismissal is what most judges would be thinking of, which is basically a go out and sin no more type of warning. You're still under supervision. So if you commit a new offense, then they get really tough on you. If he does go with something that is like community service or confining him to Trump Tower, I think Trump probably could get a suspension pending appeal from a higher court. And that may weigh into the calculation for Judge Merchan.
So let's talk about appeal, because obviously that's coming. Telegraph outlines what it says are probably some of the best bright spots for the Trump legal team on that front. Stormy Daniels' testimony, the statute itself, the vagueness of the underlying crime, the fact that defense expert witness Brad Smith, that former FEC commissioner, wasn't allowed, or at least severely limited in what he would be able to say, and the issue of presidential immunity, which we obviously are all waiting on that from the Supreme Court. What do you think is the best option on appeal, Tom?
I think they have a number of options at their disposal. I think maybe the best one is just really challenging this notion that the DA took this kind of collection of business fraud misdemeanors, kind of did some legal alchemy, put it in a pot, added in some election fraud, and presto, they've got 34 felonies. The jury was instructed along those lines. The jury clearly had some difficulty grappling with the instructions. They actually asked the judge to read those instructions back to them. And so I suspect the Trump legal team is going to come out pretty hard on the idea that there was an underlying predicate crime that was sufficient to convert this from a misdemeanor to a felony. I think they've also got arguments on the exclusion of the bulk of their experts' testimony. I think that the Trump legal team will say, look, the jury needed to be able to understand the ins and outs of election law in order to decide this case, and the judge prevented us from putting on the testimony the jury needed to hear.
So everyone, hindsight's 2020. How the prosecution did, what the defense did. The New York Times says this under the headline, how Trump's team blew it. This is a guest essay. This is an opinion piece. But they write this: instead of telling a simple story, Mr. Trump's defense was a haphazard cacophony of denials and personal attacks. It failed to focus the jury on the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, and instead tried to fight everything and everyone, even when it gained little by doing so. Jonathan, your response to that?
Well, there's always Monday morning quarterbacking. Yeah. I've talked to some members of the defense team. They feel that they did the best that they could. And quite frankly, you could have been Clarence Darrow and lost this case, because, I was hoping for a hung jury. I viewed this as either a hung jury or conviction case. And I said we had to wait for the instructions. Once the instructions came out, I said it looks like an almost guarantee for conviction. There was not a lot of room there. And this is why I tell people you shouldn't blame this jury necessarily. Those instructions were really a poison pill instruction set. I mean, they left very little room for the jury. The jury was told over and over again, and the judge said nothing. As the prosecutor said, there were election violations in this case, and they were ordered by Trump. And the defense objected to those, and the Judge Merchan just overruled every one of those. So what they heard in that courtroom, it's not too surprising in terms of a conviction, but it did create this target-rich environment for appeal. But that appeal is likely to play out after the election. But for most Americans, we obviously are as divided as we are politically. But this is something that we're not used to. For many of us, this was a political prosecution. And in my view, we haven't had this type of politicalization of the criminal justice system since John Adams. And it's really been an awakening for many people looking at this and saying, maybe this is where our rage is taking us. And we have to look again at what we're becoming if this will be the new norm.
Yeah, and there are calls we're going to talk about throughout the show today for Republicans to respond in kind, to do what they accuse Democrats of doing here, which is using the legal system for a political purpose. We'll discuss the calls for that and where they go if that's their best strategy. Meanwhile, I want to make sure we hit on Hunter Biden's case.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure on Fox News they want to make sure they hit on Hunter Biden's case. They've been covering that heavily today. But you saw there, those were three lawyers, because Shannon Bream is also a lawyer. None of them can find any merit or even explain how anyone could find any merit in Donald Trump's conviction. It was all completely one-sided. One thing that was really embarrassing, Shannon Bream showed that Reuters article where they were discussing whether he would get jail time, and one of the things it said is that judges can consider whether someone goes to trial and instead of pleading guilty and taking responsibility. Now, it's true judges can consider whether someone takes responsibility at sentencing, but judges are not allowed to punish people for exercising their constitutional right to go to trial. Now, of course, usually people do get worse sentences after trial than they would have gotten in the plea bargain, and judges get around that by claiming they're not punishing people for going to trial. It's during the trial they learn so much more about the facts and about the defendant that they now think that the person is more worthy of punishment. And if in any case that's true, it would probably be in this one because of the behavior of, Donald Trump violated the gag order in the case like 10 times by attacking witnesses, attacking the judge's family. And those are things you're not allowed to do when you're the defendant in a case. And so maybe that will have some bearing on whether he gets jail time or not. Although, as you may recall, I said months ago that this kind of case generally won't result in jail time. It's probably, with a nonviolent first-time offender of the lowest level felony, it'd probably be probation, maybe a small amount of confinement or some other punishment. But this also had a really bad effect on the 2016 election. It may have even affected the outcome of the 2016 election. And you saw there Jonathan Turley getting all upset about how the jury was told that Trump directed Michael Cohen to commit campaign finance violations. Well, I showed you that's what Michael Cohen said in his guilty plea. He specifically said he was directed. I mean, that was evidence in the case. So if they decided they wanted to believe that from Michael Cohen, that is the crime that was being covered up by the falsification of business records. And it's a campaign finance violation because if you look at the summary that went with the charging document for Michael Cohen, they mention the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971. You can't give more than $2,700 contribution or anything worth more than $2,700 to a campaign, and corporations can't donate to campaigns at all. And this was a $130,000 payment that benefited the campaign. That was not reported, was over the $2,700 limit and came from a corporation. So there's like multiple violations there that the falsification of business records was covering up. I don't know why it's so difficult for anyone on Fox News to understand what's a pretty simple series of facts and not that difficult to understand law, and calling it some like big conspiracy on the part of the judge and the prosecutor to fool the jury into convicting. It was like there was no place for them to go. Well, I mean, if they didn't think he did it, if they thought the facts weren't true, but, if they believed all the facts, and then beyond a reasonable doubt, there you go. And that's what happened. So I talked about it a lot last week too. But anyway, I wanted to do that extra criticism of the Fox News Sunday News Summary and legal expert panel, even though I pre-criticized it somewhat, especially the Shannon Bream part at the beginning. But now I'm going to show you the CBS News Face the Nation News Summary with two different reporters. It's Robert Costa and Jan Crawford talking to Margaret Brennan in what I think is a more fair and balanced analysis of the week's news over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. The 7-week New York criminal trial is over. Former President Donald Trump has been found guilty on all 34 charges against him, and he is now able to campaign freely until July 11th, when he will be sentenced. That's exactly 4 days before he is officially nominated at the party's convention in Milwaukee. As a felon, Trump cannot own a firearm or serve in a jury, but he can vote for himself, as he can run and be elected president. But we are clearly in uncharted territory, and it will be some time before we can fully see the impact of the conviction. Our new CBS News poll finds that 57% of Americans think the jury reached the right verdict, with virtually the same share, 56%, saying he received a fair trial. As more evidence of the partisan split in America, 96% of Democrats said the guilty verdict was the right one. So did 56% of independents. But 8 in 10 Republicans say the verdict was the wrong one and that the trial was not fair. Finally, half think that Trump is not fit to be president now that he's convicted, with 40% saying he is and 8% unsure. What you just heard Trump say about the case coming from Washington is not true. Charges in this case were brought by the Manhattan District Attorney. It is a state case, which means an appeal would not automatically go to the Supreme Court. For analysis and context, we want to bring in our chief campaign and elections correspondent, Robert Costa, who covers Trump and the entire trial for us in New York, and our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, who has been covering the Supreme Court for decades. But Jan, nothing like this ever before. Jen, can you help us to understand? Trump said he will try to appeal this conviction. What is the next step?
Well, I mean, as he said, this is a long way from over, but there is, I think, zero chance this is going to be overturned before November. And the road ahead for Trump on appeal doesn't look too good either. As for timing, he's got 30 days to file what's called a notice of appeal. That's procedural. That could then start the process through the New York court state system, which could take over a year. Now, you said, as you pointed out in the intro, his supporters have been kind of throwing around the Supreme Court should get involved, the Supreme Court this. But you have to go through, when you're challenging a criminal conviction, the state court system first. Then he would turn to try to get the Supreme Court to take the case by raising constitutional issues. As for the appeal itself that he'll try to file, the lawyers throughout the trial, I think, were laying the groundwork for possible issues from start to finish. I mean, starting with the venue in heavily Democratic New York, the indictment, the charges themselves, a pretty novel legal theory, bringing in federal election law to a state case. He's going to talk about the evidence that was allowed or not allowed. He could talk about the jury instructions and certain components of that, even attacking the impartiality of the judge himself. But that is a very tough road to hoe. He's got to show this is clear, reversible error. That is very difficult to do on any kind of appeal. And so, I mean, that's why people say, Bob, if you're ever in trouble, spend your money on a good trial lawyer, because once you get into the appeals process, the odds are not good, and not good for Donald Trump here.
Bob, the political impact here, obviously, we're in the early stages, but we know that Lara Trump, who's chair of the RNC, said on another network this morning they had raised $70 million in 48 hours. Is this only helpful?
It's helpful in terms of raising money, but for former President Trump, there is still a logistical nightmare on the horizon. When I spoke to his lawyer, Todd Blanche, he didn't rule out the possibility that Trump could be in jail during the Republican National Convention. When sentencing happens on July 11th, there's an expectation he could be put on probation. But this was a tense trial. I was there for 7 weeks. When you sat inside that court, at times the judge cleared the courtroom because he was so frustrated with the defense and one of the witnesses that was being called. Trump violated the gag order multiple times. So Republicans, the top Republicans in this country, are privately telling me they're not ruling out the possibility that Trump could be in prison when he accepts the nomination. There's a real concern that some traditional Republicans, suburban Republicans, might look at someone being called a convicted felon and say, I really can't go there, even as it motivates so many of Trump's core supporters.
But, Jan, I mean, from all the research we've done, it seems like legal experts do not believe that there will be jail time.
Not in this kind of case. Not in this kind of case.
Is that just a political talking point?
His age. I mean, I think it would be pretty shocking to most people who follow the New York court system that he would get jail time for this.
And that's not just because of Secret Service detail.
No,
or who he is.
if he's treated like other defendants facing a similar charge. Again, also because of his age, he would be a first-time offender, and the charge itself is somewhat unusual, bringing in that federal election law. So typically in these kind of cases, you would have other charges, fraud charges, that could then carry jail time. So that makes this case different as well. It's just this one issue.
But he does now have a criminal record. And there are 3 other criminal cases. Just to remind people, in the federal level, the special counsel has the 2. One related to national security and mishandling classified information. The other trying to change the outcome of the 2020 election. And then there's the Georgia case as well. When will the Supreme Court make a decision on whether Mr. Trump will face charges and trial ultimately for these federal cases?
And there, Margaret Brennan changed the topic, which was okay, because it's also important to remember that Trump has 3 other criminal cases pending. I definitely agree with that analysis from Jan Crawford, kind of what I was saying before. I did some research over the weekend and looked at this whole table of people convicted of felony falsification of business records in New York, and it's hard to find anyone, like Jan Crawford was saying, who got sentenced just for the felony. Usually people had some other crime, it's hard to find a case of someone just convicted of that felony, and it is a lower level nonviolent felony. Although one of the things that, like I said earlier, first, he had a lot of bad conduct during the trial that would weigh in favor of giving him some jail time. But the whole thing about him being a first-time offender that I wanted to mention in regards to what Margaret Brennan was talking about at the end there is, if he gets convicted in any of these other cases, especially if he loses the election, and then there'll be plenty of time for all of them to go before he starts destroying them with his presidential powers or whatever. But if he gets convicted in one of these other cases, well, first of all, the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case, people go to prison for that all the time, even first-time offenders. And the point I'm about to make here is he won't be a first-time offender. He will have a criminal record the next time he's sentenced, which will make it much more likely, if he gets convicted in one of these other 3 cases, that he will get significant jail time, which is kind of a weird thing. How are they going to work out his Secret Service protection? And that is something that will probably happen if he gets a second conviction, unless something extraordinary like a pardon or commutation, or who knows. But at least if he's treated the same as everybody else, then it would be likely he would go to jail. If he's treated like everyone else in this case, I think it's not likely that he'll get a jail sentence, or over, maybe a small one, based on his lack of taking responsibility and his violations of the gag order and those things. We'll see. But I want to get now to the next news summary, the NBC News Meet the Press one. It's Peter Alexander, and he also has a couple reporters on here. Do I have that right? Oh, wait. No, sorry. I have one more in between. It's the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos one I wanted to show you, with Aaron Katersky and Rachel Scott, who also, I think, did a really thorough job of covering this journalistically, as opposed to what you saw from Fox News. Sorry, I almost skipped a news summary. Here's the ABC This Week one. George Stephanopoulos, Aaron Katersky, and Rachel Scott covering some of that same ground over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. In 1774, John Adams said, "Representative government and trial by jury are the heart and lungs of liberty." 250 years later, the heart and lungs of liberty are facing what may be the ultimate stress test. 12 anonymous jurors rendered their verdict on Thursday, finding Donald Trump guilty on all counts. It's the 3rd time in the last 2 years that jurors have rendered verdicts against Trump. Jurors have yet to consider charges against Trump for even more serious crimes: blocking the peaceful transfer of power, concealing classified documents, encouraging the filing of false electors. But for now, the New York jurors have already presented their fellow citizens with a choice. Do we want to be represented, to be led for the first time in history by a convicted felon? That answer will come in November. This morning, we analyze all the fallout from this week's historic decision, starting with senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katersky. Good morning, Aaron. You were at the courthouse every single day. Paint that scene on Thursday.
I think it was around count 4 when former President Trump realized the gravity of the moment, George. He had been laughing and joking with his attorneys because everybody thought the jury was going to go home for the day, the judge ready to dismiss them, and then he came back out on the bench and announced that the jury had reached a verdict. And he became a convicted criminal from the moment the foreman, in his soft Irish lilt, pronounced guilty. And it took 2 minutes to go 34 count by count by count. And at count 4, that's when former President Trump shut his eyes and subtly shook his head as if to block out what was happening to him.
So what happens next? We have sentencing on July 11th.
Sentencing on July 11th, and the former president is taking something of a risk by continuing to attack the judge, because at sentencing, Judge Juan Merchan has full discretion to consider Trump's remorse, whether he's shown remorse and whether he's shown respect for the law. And before any of that happens, he sits with the probation department, which is almost unimaginable.
But for this kind of a crime, first-time offender, almost 80 years old, unlikely he's going to face any jail time.
It seems unlikely. I can't wrap my head around a former president of the United States going to prison, and there's almost no precedent for anyone convicted of felony falsification of business records being sentenced to prison time. But there is one caveat here, and that's the way the case was charged. Trump was accused of falsifying the records to cover up a conspiracy in order to mess with the 2016 election. No other defendant has ever been charged with falsification to subvert democracy.
Even before we get to the actual sentencing, the former president has to undergo a pre-sentencing investigation. What do we know about that?
That's with the probation department, and I'm not sure how deep they're going to be able to go with Donald Trump. His lawyers may try to limit it, but in theory, the probation department is supposed to get a window into your entire personal, familial, and financial history before making a pronouncement on what the sentence should be and giving that recommendation to the judge. This would be the first time anyone has dug that deep into Donald Trump.
Aaron Katersky, thanks very much.
Thanks, George.
Speaking of Rachel Scott, is covering the Trump campaign. We've seen former President Trump lash out. His supporters fall in line.
Yeah, it was defiance and fury from the former president. In a 30-minute speech at Trump Tower, he did lash out at the judge. He called him a devil. As Aaron just pointed out, many this morning are questioning why the former president would go after the very judge that is responsible for deciding his fate, with sentencing now just a few weeks away. There are also questions this morning about whether the former president violated the gag order by going after his former fixer and friend Michael Cohen, calling him a sleazebag. But this morning, the Republican Party falling in line, standing behind the former president, even those who have been critical of him in the past. President Biden speaking for the first time, insisting that this verdict should be respected and blasting the Republican efforts to undermine the verdict, calling that dangerous, George.
And Rachel, we have a new poll out this morning with Ipsos that gives at least some early indications of how Americans may be receiving the verdict.
Yeah, early indications. This is our new ABC News Ipsos poll. It was taken after the verdict was reached, and it's a little bit of a mixed bag here, George. So 50% of Americans believe that the guilty verdict of Donald Trump was in fact correct. But then on the other end of this, you have 47% of Americans who believe that the charges brought against the former president were politically motivated. The bottom line here, we are 5 months out from the election, and these are still two deeply unpopular candidates, with Trump's favorability rating sitting at 31%. President Biden not much higher at 32, George.
And Rachel, among those voters who dislike both candidates, the poll seems to show that there's some impact of the verdict.
Still some impact of the verdict, with 65% of those who don't like either of the candidates believing that this was actually correct. And still a large amount of those voters also believe that the former president should be ending his presidential campaign, George.
Rachel Scott, thanks very much. Let's bring in one of former President Trump's attorneys, Will Scharf. Will, thanks for joining.
And I will have a clip of Will Scharf because I want to show how the so-called liberal media, the mainstream media, the actual journalistic outlets that I'm covering, all had someone with the Trump point of view on to discuss this case, unlike Fox News Sunday that barely did. I'll show you like the barest minimum that they, with Juan Williams, after I finish the next two news summaries. But I thought that was a good analysis also from ABC. You can compare it to CBS there, and see who, that you have Robert Costa and Jan Crawford on CBS, and then Aaron Katersky and Rachel Scott covering different aspects for ABC. I don't know which team you think did it better. The Aaron Katersky analysis on jail time, I think, was again similar, but and similar to what I had said earlier, and he does bring up one additional point for sentencing where the judge is supposed to look at the harm from the crimes, and this was a crime where the jury found it was done to use dishonest, illegal means to affect the 2016 election. And that's actually a lot of harm. A lot of bad things happened from that. And the other thing that also it makes me think of that I haven't heard someone mention is another thing the judge is supposed to take into account is the chance of recidivism. Would he do it again? And yeah, I mean, he's running right now, and do you think he wouldn't use illegal means to affect the outcome in the next election if he had the chance? He has no remorse and no boundaries, no limits, just like what can he get away with? And he's finally gotten caught and gotten some criminal liability for the many things, going all the way back to the Mueller report and his obstruction for justice that never got charged. And anyway, I want to finish the news summaries. Like I said, there are 2 more NBC News Meet the Press, not reporters, just Peter Alexander doing fairly thorough job of covering the same ground over here.
Good Sunday morning. I'm Peter Alexander in for Kristen Welker. For the first time in American history, a former president has been convicted of a crime. This past week, a Manhattan jury concluded beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump falsified business records in order to influence the 2016 election, finding him guilty on all 34 counts, felony crimes. Mr. Trump, who chose not to testify, instead vented his anger outside the courtroom, claiming the trial was rigged against him and vowing to appeal.
This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
In the days since, the former president's allies, including vice presidential hopefuls, have lined up to rail against the trial and its outcome and have attacked Democrats, claiming the fix was in from the start.
What happened there was outrageous, and you're right, the American people see it. This is a purely political exercise, not a legal one.
This is the most outrageous travesty I've ever seen, and the problem here is Democrats have crossed this line. They have crossed the line in which now the court system is a political weapon.
This is the weaponization of the justice system against their political opponent. This is a justice system that hunts Republicans while protecting Democrats. This was certainly a hoax, a sham.
Next up, Mr. Trump's sentencing. That's set for July 11th, just days before he's supposed to officially accept the Republican Party's nomination. With Mr. Trump's other criminal cases in Washington, Florida, and Georgia all bogged down with significant delays, the Manhattan case is likely to be the only trial Mr. Trump faces before Election Day. The question now, will the verdict impact the view of voters? Our first indication, a poll conducted in the days after the verdict, shows that a majority of voters across the political spectrum say Mr. Trump's conviction will not affect their vote. And now that Mr. Trump has been convicted, the Biden campaign is looking for ways to shake up a race that has largely remained stagnant. This morning, NBC News reports the Biden team is now accelerating its timetable to get more aggressive, plans it had been holding on to for later this summer. That includes sharpening its message to argue that Mr. Trump is more focused on himself than he is on voters. President Biden, who mostly stayed away from commenting during the trial, finally weighed in.
The jury heard 5 weeks of evidence, 5 weeks. And after careful deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. They found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts. Now he'll be given the opportunity, as he should, to appeal that decision just like everyone else has that opportunity. That's how the American system of justice works. And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
And joining me now, Republican Senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton.
And I don't have a clip of Tom Cotton, but that's an important piece of evidence of what I was saying before, that all the other networks other than Fox News had someone on to talk extensively about the Trump position on the trial. In fact, I think that Meet the Press news summary was a little bit biased towards Trump there, because it did have that clip from Joe Biden at the end, though it still talked about his right to appeal. But Joe Biden was just like, didn't say anything about Donald Trump other than he'd been convicted, and, he was trying to uphold the rule of law and, the integrity of the system. But at the beginning, NBC actually gave a lot of time there to Trump and his allies railing against the verdict. Certainly a lot more than you see the opposite from on Fox News. Certainly that didn't even appear in the Fox News Sunday news summary. So, but in some ways, I think it might have been too much. You can let me know what you think in the comments section, and I'm going to get to the last of the news summaries, CNN State of the Union. It's not Jake Tapper or Dana Bash this week. It's Casey Hunt, who used to be Casey DC on Morning Joe like couple years ago, before she switched over to CNN. And I always liked Casey Hunt, so it's nice to see her over on State of the Union, giving the under 90-second news summary to finish up on the same facts, of course, over here.
Hello, I'm Casey Hunt in Washington, where the State of our Union is in uncharted territory. For the first time ever, a former U.S. president, Donald Trump, is a felon, convicted on 34 counts. He'll be sentenced by a judge just months before he stands in the presidential election. Last night, Trump leaned into his stance as a self-proclaimed, quote, warrior, with a visit to the Ultimate Fighting Championship in New Jersey. And the Republican Party seems to be buying his message. Trump has raised tens of millions in donations since the verdict Thursday in New York, as Republican officials of all stripes are backing him and attacking the U.S. judicial system. But the effect on his bid to unseat President Joe Biden, particularly among independent voters, is far from clear, not to mention the legal consequences of his conviction, which he will appeal. His attorney, Todd Blanche, told the AP he plans to argue strenuously against potential prison time. And Trump was asked about the possibility he'll face house arrest or prison on Fox.
It could.
What that could.
I'm okay with it. I don't know that the public would stand it. I'm not sure the public would stand for it. With a,
if they tried house arrest or.
I think it would be tough for the public to take. At a certain point, there's a breaking point.
And joining me this morning is Republican National Committee co-chair and the president's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump.
So yeah, you can see, I'm going to have a clip of Lara Trump in a little bit. CNN had both Lara Trump and Chris Sununu, who was a supporter of Nikki Haley, but is still voting for Donald Trump, even though Nikki Haley once said that Americans won't vote for a convicted felon. They just won't. And he had to respond to that clip, but I decided to show you Lara Trump, not Chris Sununu, from there. And anyway, that's the last of the news summaries. You can tell me who you think did it best and whatever. They're not, some of it's apples to oranges, because the shortest one there is 90 seconds and the longest one is like 6 minutes 21 seconds. So it's hard to compare those, but you can compare the long one, the 3 long ones, and the 2 short ones. Well, it's 3 long ones, a middle one, and a short one this week. What can you do? But I think it actually kind of deserved more coverage, and maybe some more, straight legal analysis of like the facts of the case. Maybe they didn't want to talk about Stormy Daniels on a Sunday. I don't know. That would be my other criticism of even the good news summaries there. But now I'm going to get to the newsmaker clips, and the point I was making before I show the next clip, which is the brief mention of the non-Trump side of the argument on his convictions that happened on Fox News Sunday. Very brief, very tangential. but all the other programs had on at least one person taking the Trump position. Lara Trump and kind of Chris Sununu on State of the Union, and Tom Cotton, who I don't have a clip of, was on Meet the Press, but you saw that he was going to be on Meet the Press. Doug Burgum over on CBS News Face the Nation, still trying out to be Trump's vice president. And then Will Scharf, a actual Trump attorney on ABC this week with George Stephanopoulos. I'll show you that clip as well, or a clip from that as well. But first, I want to show you, you saw the whole news summary from Fox News Sunday earlier. You saw the two legal experts who couldn't find any disagreement or any validity whatsoever to the conviction of Donald Trump. They couldn't even explain what the crime was, even though I explained it to you in 2 minutes earlier. And anyway, they then had multiple panel discussions that briefly talked about the Trump conviction, and mostly in terms of its political effect. And this is Shannon Bream asking Juan Williams, their one person on the left on the panel, about the political effect. And it's will the backlash against this verdict, because everyone is taking Trump's side, right? At least in Fox News world. So will the backlash be kind of like the backlash on abortion that helps Democrats? And somewhere partway through his answer, Juan Williams does kind of say something in favor of the verdict against Donald Trump. This is the most it can sneak in anywhere on Fox News, I guess, which I'll talk about a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Now we look at how this guilty verdict is going to play out for President Trump, because he's raised tens of millions of dollars. It was Punchbowl that said an angry voter is a motivated voter. That's the GOP argument. Trump and his supporters are very angry following the blockbuster verdict. Juan, do you worry that it turns them out the same way that overturning Roe v. Wade has turned out Democrats?
No. The Trump base is not moving away from Donald Trump. I must say, with regard to the Senate races, I think a lot of those Democratic incumbents, in fact, are looking at abortion as an issue, are looking at corporate excesses as an issue, China. Those Democratic Senate candidates see Trump as divisive, as we just discussed in Maryland. It's a problem for Hogan. But in terms of the general stuff, you would think with any ordinary politician, Shannon, a conviction, 34 felony convictions, people will be saying, maybe we should remove this guy from the ballot going into the Republican convention. We're not seeing any of that. That's not even a point of discussion. Republicans are standing strong behind Donald Trump. He is their hero. And I mean, it's now a civil conviction on business fraud. He lost the defamation case for sexual assault, and now the 34. So the reality is, for Democrats, you have a different set of incentives. And the different set of incentives for the Democrats is that the verdict brings them together. I don't know how many Democrats said to me this week, wow, finally, all the lies, the bullying, finally he got caught. Finally, someone held this man accountable. They're energized on the other side of the equation. Up in the air, the people who've been voting for Haley in Democratic primaries, the kind of swing voters. And I think this verdict penetrated anybody's media bubble. Everybody knows what happened.
Well, and now the White House and the Biden-Harris campaign has to think about how they manage this, because Hunter Biden is going to trial potentially tomorrow without a deal and could end up a convicted felon, potentially.
So, of course, Shannon Bream has to switch over to Hunter Biden after that brief mention from Juan Williams, and finally, Democrats, at least he's talking about first, Republicans, but then, I've talked to Democrats who say finally this man got caught. Finally, he's being held accountable. And he mentioned some of the civil stuff that has held him accountable recently. But that's it from Fox News. That was the most view from the left on all of the Fox News Sunday program, which was kind of pathetic and was mixed in with the political thing. And Juan Williams said that Nikki Haley was getting votes in the Democratic primaries. I think that was a mistake. And the part where he said, Republicans are standing strong with Trump. I mean, that doesn't really sound like a criticism, does it? It's like Republicans have lost their moral compass, that they're standing with it happened long ago. Maybe all the way back at the Access Hollywood tape, or when Trump started attacking John McCain, because he likes war heroes who haven't been captured or whatever. But he's just been a train wreck of immorality and norm breaking and anti-constitutional behavior and now crimes. He has 3 other pending felony trials, but the first one, probably like all the others, if they get to a jury, because the evidence is very strong in all of them, convictions. And finally being held accountable, like Juan Williams said, and at least someone said it somewhere on Fox News, even though it was buried like 45, 50 minutes into the program in the middle of a panel discussion with 3 other people, and of course Shannon Bream immediately turning to Hunter Biden. But anyway, I am going to show you a couple Republicans who appeared on the mainstream media journalistic outlets. I'm going to show you 3 different Republicans: Will Scharf, a lawyer for Trump; Governor Doug Burgum, a vice presidential hopeful; and then Lara Trump, the wife of Donald Trump's son, Eric. And I'll talk about some of their bogus arguments, starting with Will Scharf talking to George Stephanopoulos yesterday over here.
On Thursday, you praised the jury. You said that they were considering the law and the evidence seriously, and you predicted a just verdict. Do you accept their decision now?
No, I think when you look at the jury instructions here, Judge Merchan essentially, I wouldn't say rigged the deliberations, but certainly steered the jury towards the verdict that he clearly wanted. We're going to be challenging Judge Merchan's failure to recuse on appeal. I think it constitutes a clear due process violation. We're obviously going to be challenging aspects of the jury instructions themselves as well. I think there's a lot of appellate material there.
That's quite a change for you. Before the verdict came out, you said that the jury instructions are quite favorable to your side. So when you think they're going your way, the instructions are favorable. When the jury rules against you, the judge made a mistake?
I think hope for the best, plan for the worst, George. But I think when you look at the totality of the circumstances in this case, this is a prosecution that should have never been brought. This was a case tried in front of a judge who clearly should have recused. I think we have a lot of fair complaints with the way that this trial was conducted. And I think ultimately President Trump will be vindicated on appeal.
The ethics panel for the state of New York said the judge was not required to recuse.
Well, I think when you look at binding Supreme Court precedent, including most notably the seminal case on judicial recusal, Caperton v. Massey, even the appearance of impropriety can require a judge to recuse for reasons of due process. Here, I think we have far more than an appearance of impropriety. The fact that Judge Merchan contributed to Joe Biden during the 2020 election, many of the other issues that we've raised in our recusal papers throughout this case, I think Judge Merchan should have clearly recused, and I think that's going to be an issue that the appellate courts are going to have to deal with.
If appearance of impropriety is the standard for recusal, then why shouldn't Justice Thomas and Justice Alito?
George Stephanopoulos kind of took the bait there after kind of a pretty good cross-examination and switched subject to Supreme Court justices away from the main topic. Finally, the main topic of the Sunday shows, convicted felon Donald Trump. And but I thought before that both of his questions were good, where he caught Will Scharf. I saw some of the coverage where a lot of the Trump lawyers were saying that things were looking good and they had faith in the jury and they got good instructions. Some of the instructions were not favorable to the prosecution, especially the one about causation. I thought that was a little bit worrisome for the prosecution as to how they had to show that Trump caused the business record to be created. And I mean, for some of the counts anyway, that might have been a problem, but it turned out not to be. And then coming back where George Stephanopoulos even knew that Will Scharf had said that he liked the jury instructions, and his explanation for, why he totally flip-flopped was, like, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, or like change your story based on if your Pollyannish commentary before the verdict turns out not to be accurate. It's, anyway, not much of an explanation, but no follow-up from George Stephanopoulos because he took the bait. And I also didn't think this cross-examination by Margaret Brennan of Governor Doug Burgum from North Dakota, who's a vice presidential hopeful, was very good. She did have a couple facts that she pushed back on, but she also kind of takes the bait when he goes after the media for the Hunter Biden laptop. She doesn't cross-examine him on any of the important facts to the nation about the Trump conviction on these felonies. Instead, she starts defending the media and her own program and journalistic integrity, which is exactly, I think, what the maybe he did well here as a possible vice presidential candidate, because he definitely got Margaret Brennan to take the bait in this cross-examination that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
You just heard our polling there. 57% of Americans think the jury reached the right verdict. 56% think Trump got a fair trial. A majority of Americans are unconvinced by this claim that it's all a sham. Why do you think it is?
Well, I think part of it, of course, polling is a point in time, and I had a chance to briefly look at some of your poll numbers this morning, and I also saw in there that almost 2/3 of the respondents said they weren't paying close attention. And I understand that they're not paying close attention to the trial because most Americans out there, they've got working Americans don't have time to watch TV all day, read every report, because they're facing all the things, putting food on the table, gas in the car, all the challenges that they're facing. And I think that as this moment in time passes, when we have the election coming this fall, people are going to make a decision about are they better off today than they were 4 years ago? And this is an unusual thing that President Trump's not a candidate that's unknown or never run before. They had an opportunity to live their life under 4 years of him, and they had a chance to, prosper, and they had a chance to understand what the world was like, no wars. And now that it's a very different situation. So I think, it's interesting and it's captivating right now to a lot of people. The election is not going to turn on this trial.
The U.S. isn't involved in a war right now either. But
we're involved in 2 proxy wars.
We were then as well. But on your point, Donald Trump spends a lot of time talking about these trials. It's not just journalists, and it's historic, but he talks quite a lot about it. And in fact, he held an extensive news conference Friday with a litany of grievances against the judge, who will still have to decide on his sentencing. Personal judgment-wise, do you think that was a smart thing to do?
Well, I have a lot of empathy for what he must feel like, and because as a business person, I spent 30 years in tech, but a lot of that was in software that dealt with business processes. I mean, I've never seen anything like this, where you can, magically take a transaction that gets spread out over 11 paychecks, 12 vouchers, 11 invoices, and suddenly each of those around one decision, they magically become a set of misdemeanors. They become a felony. And if they're
because of the election fraud, as you just heard.
I don't know that anybody in America, if we're asking about the voter, I don't know anybody in America can explain how a business transaction filing errors from 7 years ago become federal election law, when federal election law is not a state. This is brought in a county court. Federal election is federal. And I don't know, the alchemy of transforming these misdemeanors, which had a 2-year statute of limitations. So I'm saying, from a business perspective, CEOs around America, if you've had hundreds of millions of business filings in America in the last 7 years, why aren't our courts clogged with other CEOs that were dragged in front of the court?
If they were running for president and changing those business records to obscure donations to their own campaign, you know what I'm saying. This isn't just filing error.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but most Americans cannot explain it. Many of the legal experts that stood on the curb outside the courthouse for 6 weeks can't explain it. So Americans are going to come back to the issues that affect them, because this trial outcome doesn't affect them. Their inflation affects them.
It does. And I want to talk about some of those issues more in depth with you in a few minutes. We just put up a graph to show you our polling. It's 2/3 of those polled said they are watching closely. But in terms of the bookkeeping argument, this was about a criminal conspiracy to influence an election and creating paperwork to cover it up. If the quibble is about paperwork violations, the President of the United States, his son, says under the influence of drugs, he committed a paperwork error. That's now going to federal court because of what he did in purchasing that gun. That was a paperwork violation. Are you also offended by that? Is that also a miscarriage of justice?
Well, I think what's sad for America is the whole weaponization of the system, and what we're going to see more of this. I mean, earlier in my life...
You think it's weaponized against Hunter Biden?
I think that is weaponized against President Trump, but if you're going to talk about equivalency in the courts, then we know that media companies have acknowledged that they worked in conjunction with the federal government to suppress information about Hunter Biden's laptop during an election year.
That is not true whatsoever when it comes to this journalist or the journalists involved with this program.
Well, then why were his stories about it taken down off of media companies? Why was it being suppressed during that election? Why talk about the Steele dossier? I mean, we could go back. There is all kinds of things going on in our country related to election integrity, and I think whether you're an independent, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, we should all care about election integrity. And if we want to have equivalency, then to make sure that we have a level playing field.
We have to finish this conversation on the other side of this commercial break. So let me do that, and we'll finish.
And on the other side of the commercial break, they started talking about energy policy, because that's something Doug Burgum knows a lot about. And that was the extent of Margaret Brennan's cross-examination. Was actually a little better than I remember the last time I watched it. She did actually push back on some of the Trump conviction-related things, like explaining what it was he was charged, what the crime was, and the falsification of business records to cover up another crime, in effect the 2016 campaign. It's I think the jury had three choices in the jury instructions: either the violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, that's what Michael Cohen pled guilty to in federal court and said he was directed to do it by Donald Trump, so that's one crime that the falsification of business records could have been covering up. The other is falsification of other business records, and the other is violation of tax laws because of the way they grossed up the reimbursement to Michael Cohen to make it look like income. And anyway, those were all the possible crimes that the falsification of business records law in New York, the felony business records falsification, only requires the intent to conceal some other crime, and those are the other crimes. And anyway, Margaret Brennan did do some pushback on that a little bit, but she did also take the bait at the end. I guess she's the one who brought up Hunter Biden, but the whole laptop thing and the Steele dossier, that went far afield too quickly, I think. But you can let me know what you think about that cross-examination. And I have one more Republican getting cross-examined, and that's Lara Trump, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, and also co-chair of the Republican National Committee now. And this is about a really innocuous tweet that former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan put up in that half hour before the verdict was announced, before we knew what the verdict was going to be. He put up this tweet that said, "Regardless of the result, I urge all Americans to respect the verdict and the legal process." And then he was quote tweeted by someone from the Trump campaign, "Your campaign just ended." I mean, he's the Republican nominee for Senate in Maryland, a blue state, but he was just the governor, and he's probably like the only Republican who could win Maryland, and Republicans supposedly want to win back the Senate. Now, there is this weird conspiracy theory that Casey Hunt doesn't bring up in her cross-examination here, that it actually helps Larry Hogan in Maryland to be in a fight with Trump and the Republican Party. And maybe there is some weird, unseen plan to bolster his campaign. But even so, the co-chair of the Republican National Committee should not be trashing their candidate for Senate in Maryland, which, because of Casey Hunt's cross-examination, Lara Trump doubles and I think even triples down on in this clip.
Republican Senate candidate Larry Hogan in Maryland, and again, I'm asking you this in your capacity as one of the co-chairs of the entire Republican Party, and he's a popular former governor in Maryland. He wrote this right ahead of the verdict. He said, quote, "Regardless of the result, I urge all Americans to respect the verdict and the legal process." That is not the Republican Party line at the moment, and in fact, he was attacked by the top Trump advisor, Chris LaCivita, who wrote that he, quote, "just ended your campaign, end quote. Does the Republican National Committee support Larry Hogan for Senate?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I don't support what he just said there. I think it's ridiculous. And I think anybody who's not speaking up in the face of really something that should never again have seen the light of day, a trial that would never have been brought against any other person aside from Donald Trump.
But does the RNC support his bid?
The respect of anyone. Well,
he doesn't deserve the respect of anyone?
He doesn't deserve the respect of anyone in the Republican Party at this point. And quite frankly, anybody in America, if that's the way you feel, that's very upsetting to hear that.
So are you willing to cede the Senate seat in Maryland to the Democratic Party and not support Larry Hogan?
What I'll tell you is that we, of course, want to win as a party, but that is a shame. And I think he should have thought long and hard before he said that publicly.
Are you willing to use Republican Party resources to support his bid or not? It sounds like you're saying you're not.
Well, I'll get back to you on all the specifics monetarily, but what I can tell you is that as the Republican Party co-chair, I think he should never have said something like that. I think that's ridiculous.
Okay. And finally, we are, of course, 5 months out from the election, and we haven't heard a lot of Republicans give straight answers to what is a pretty simple question about the election. So I just want to ask you directly, will you commit to accepting the election results?
So I just kept that playing so you could see where Casey Hunt gave up on that cross-examination about the co-chair of the Republican Party supporting the Republican nominee for Senate in Maryland, which is kind of surprising that she couldn't get her to give any support to Larry Hogan. Oh, and by the way, you can read the whole transcript of that interview if you want to see what Lara Trump says about whether she'll accept the results of the election. It's basically kind of a dodge, if it's a free, fair, and transparent election, which I don't know, is that better? But here, I'll put a link to the full transcript of the CNN State of the Union show there if you want to see the rest of that. But I have one more newsmaker clip before my bonus clip of my two cats battling in a chair that I will play before I finish the program. But I wanted to show this one guest who has some of the best insight into this case. He was the head of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office before Alvin Bragg. This is Cyrus Vance, who you'll hear Trump say he passed on this case, and so he knew it was a political case, and he actually gets asked about that, and also about whether Judge Merchan, he gave like $30 to the Biden campaign, which he shouldn't have done, but it's not necessarily enough for recusal, especially because it went through the New York Court of Appeals, like George Stephanopoulos said, talking to Will Scharf, and he was found not to need to recuse himself. But anyway, here's Cyrus Vance both giving his opinion of Judge Merchan and also whether the case against Trump was political over in this clip.
Let me ask you about one of the key criticisms here. Mr. Trump and his allies, they keep taking aim at Judge Juan Merchan. He did give $15 to the Biden campaign in 2020, gave an additional $20 to Democratic causes then. Even if he wasn't technically required to recuse himself, should Judge Merchan have recused himself just to avoid even the appearance of a conflict?
I really don't think a $20 donation and a $30 donation rise to the level of a serious appearance of a conflict. Obviously, Senator Cotton and others who are speaking for the president strongly disagree with that. I look at that both as de minimis, and secondly, that it has been reviewed by the courts in New York and determined not to be a grounds for recusal. I know Judge Merchan. Obviously, we were before Judge Merchan. He was our grand jury judge when we prosecuted the Trump Organization. And I think he is honest as the day is long. He was careful, he was caring, and I think he handled a very difficult trial with a neutral hand, and gave the president every benefit of the doubt that he was entitled to under the law.
Then quickly to conclude, Donald Trump and his allies have branded this case a witch hunt. You've heard that in particular they have been critical of DA Alvin Bragg and a key member of his team who was hired directly from the Biden Justice Department. How do you respond to the criticism that this was a political prosecution?
Do you remember when Michael Cohen was indicted by U.S. Attorney Lara in 2015? The president, the incoming president, President Trump, asked Barrara to stay on, and that investigation continued. So President Trump fired Barrara, and he brought in a Republican U.S. attorney, Jeff Berman. Excellent man, great lawyer. Jeff Berman continued the investigation into the president, so the president fired him too. So this has really not been just, it's the Justice Department under a Democrat and this president investigated this president's conduct, and the president's response in both instances was to kill the case.
Cyrus Vance, we appreciate your joining us.
Yeah, and I wanted to play that clip because it's a reminder of what the Trump Justice Department did. Even though the Southern District of New York under Jeffrey Berman, like I said, took the plea of Michael Cohen that I showed earlier. You can read the whole thing down a link I put under sources in the video description, where he said he was directed by Donald Trump to commit this campaign finance violation. That's one of the things that was being covered up by these false business records. That's why they were felonies in the first degree. That's why Trump has 34 felony convictions in New York now. That's the final newsmaker clip I want to show you. I appreciate all of you who showed up. I have a larger audience than usual. I saw someone in the live comments earlier asking, like, if I'm uploading these videos every week. The live stream does become an archived, recorded show. I think it takes like 12 hours to publish. It's usually like Tuesday morning, and when you go to my channel, it shows the videos, but then you have to click on live. I like lobbied for a long time to not have them make that change on YouTube, but they did it years ago. And so yeah, if you want to find my recorded live streams, you go to my channel and you click on live. And I've been doing this Monday Media Mix-Up every week for 157 weeks now. Before that, I did it for several years on Sundays, and I will keep coming back every Monday until January 2025, when we find out whether the person inaugurated is the same person who won in November 2024. That's got to see how at least this season of the U.S. story ends. So I think that's where the new season starts, January 2025. But before I go, I did promise a bonus clip of my cats, Cheech and Chong. We've had them for almost 6 months. We got them December 9th. They came from the shelter named Cheech and Chong, and I've shown a bunch of cute clips of them. This is upstairs on a chair doing a chair battle over here. And there you go, the Cheech and Chong chair battle to end the show. Thanks for joining me. Like I said, I'll be back next Monday, unless I have some reason to upload an edited, produced video so that people can see I'm still making videos who don't watch the live streams, I guess. And anyway, until I have some other reason to upload a video, or until next Monday, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.